Hello and welcome to a Bergkamp Wonderland podcast. Tonight it's a special featuring an interview with Alex Fynn, co-author of Arsene and Arsenal and Arsenal, the Making of a Modern Super Club. We'll be discussing his latest book and talking about his career in football and relationships with Premier League clubs, including Arsenal. Alex, I'm very happy to have you with us tonight. How are you?
I'm fine, and it's a privilege to be talking to you.
It's actually quite an interesting time for us to be talking to you today with what's been going on at the club over the last couple of weeks. So I'm looking forward to a very juicy conversation.
Well, there'll be some revelations.
Excellent stuff. Joining Alex and I are firstly my good friend and even better foe, Geoff Arsenal. How are you, Geoff?
I'm very well, thank you, Raj. How are you, sir? You good?
We've had a traumatic 2 days on Twitter, haven't we?
We certainly have, mate. It's looking very, very bleak on Twitter. But there you go. We head down into the wind, the old man used to say to me.
We're still mates, though, aren't we?
Of course we are, mate. We'll always be mates.
Excellent. And also with us tonight, our very hirsute producer, Danny, who usually stays silent on these type of shows, but has been given free rein to join in. Morning, Danny. How's life?
It's very, very good. And I'm actually honoured to be speaking to Alex because, like I was saying to Alex before we started recording, whenever people say to me, well, how should I start my Arsenal book collection? I say you buy Alex's first book and then you buy Perry Groves' autobiography. And from there, there's a great start because Alex's books are fantastic.
Excellent stuff. Let's start then. Now, Alex, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you started off with Saatchi & Saatchi a long time ago. You were involved in the inception of the Premier League. You were involved with Tottenham, I seem to hear as well. You've been involved with broadcasting rights with Manchester United and Galatasaray. I mean, how did you move from Saatchi & Saatchi into kind of football?
Well, basically because they considered I'd passed my sell-by date and I was under contract, and they thought that, well, we've still got to pay the guy, so why don't we let him do this sports marketing lark he's always on about? And that's how I got into football. But before that, Saatchi & Saatchi was the name that people always brought up. And football was no different from anybody else. Clients wanted to take advantage of what was the latest thing. Saatchi's was that. And the first football involvement we had was from Tottenham Hotspur. And I helped produce the first commercial for a football club ever. And Terry Venables denigrated it by saying it was all about image, but in reality it wasn't. It was only image through contents, by what I mean that we were trying to increase attendances and trying to sell season tickets. Unfortunately, advertising can only sell a good product, and Tottenham were not a good product, and we had to pull the advertising, much to the club's dismay, because they felt that the advertising could make up for the team's deficiencies. They didn't realize that advertising can't sell a bad product except on one occasion, and then you don't repurchase. So through doing advertising for Tottenham, I advised the Football League on television, and then subsequently the FA on the creation of the Premier League.
You're also involved in the formation of the Premier League, weren't you?
Well, success has many fathers, and you'll hear people like David Dean and Greg Dyke and Rick Parry claiming a large responsibility for the Premier League, and there is an element of truth in that. I sum it up and my involvement in the following way, that firstly, the Premier League would not have been created without the FA's approval. Otherwise, it would not have been sanctioned by FIFA or UEFA. And this is the debatable point. It was me who persuaded the FA to back the Premier League. And when I'm taken to task on this, I cite that the FA were persuaded by me to do some basic research. And the research showed, not unsurprisingly, that the fans of those clubs who wanted to break away were in favor of it. But more important, that the fans felt that it would be beneficial for the England national team. And that was the crucial point for the FA. That and the fact that if they backed the breakaway clubs, they would once and for all destroy the power of the Football League. So there was a lot of self-interest and short-termism. And although that I showed them how to restructure football and how to make money from football, the way I put it is that they showed me the door. Because surprisingly, and I know this might sound, well, he might say this, mightn't I, that I found that I had more commitment than they had. And it mattered to me more than it did to the people at the FA, and they were all for really just making sure that their nest egg was okay and not looking to the future. And that is why we have a situation whereby we might have a very popular league in the Premier League, but it's no longer an English league. It's an international league that just happens to be played in England. And as a result of that, England will never, 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 ever win the World Cup or the European Championship.
So in some ways, you could argue that the main aim, which was to make the England team a lot stronger, has been a failure in some ways, because I'd say that the England team aren't that much stronger than they were 20 years ago. I mean, how has this Premier League evolved for you in the last 20 years? Are we in a better place?
No, we're not, unless we care about club football. The FA could have said to the breakaway clubs, you start with 20 or at best situation 18, or you don't start at all. And by the way, because you can't start without us, and because we stand, the FA, for a variety of good causes, coaching, education, kids football, women's football, we're going to take 40% of the broadcast income. And the clubs would have had to go along with that. And if we'd have had a situation whereby the FA would have stood up and been counted, then we would have had a situation that was more analogous to the situation in Germany, where we would have created a system whereby both clubs and the national team would have their part in it, and everybody would find a true role. But the FA never, never thought in any visionary terms. The breakaway league to them was, for once and for all, they would get rid of the nuisance of the Football League challenging them, and they hoped that the breakaway league would help the England national team. But as I told them, it couldn't possibly if you break away with 22 clubs, because you're just playing far too many games. And not only are you playing far too many games, the games are unimportant games. They're non-event games. In the breakaway league, there was Coventry versus Oldham. Well, with due respect to those two clubs, football is all about events. There are international events, there are national events, and there are local events. But Coventry versus Oldham in a showcase top division is a non-event, and you've got to get rid of that. So you must have a maximum of 20 clubs, preferably 18. And the FA never went for that.
Moving on to your relationship with Arsenal, how did that start?
Well, that started really with the Premier League and also my friendship with David Dean. He would take an ambivalent view towards me. I like him unreservedly because we've known each other for so long. But he would feel that I can't always be trusted because I don't always agree with him. And David is a very ambitious man, but ambitious for the right reasons. Ambitious above all for Arsenal, and then secondly for himself. So we've crossed swords on a number of occasions, but in terms of work, where I did some work for Arsenal, I actually wrote the blueprint for Arsenal as one of the leading breakaway clubs. And I remember a meeting where Messrs. Dean and Hillwood came to Saatchi and Saatchi, and we presented our proposal to them. And they summed it up by saying, well, that's just about satisfactorily says what we should do and how we should do it. Unfortunately, David Dean's agenda was rather different to mine. What I wanted to do was to restructure the whole of English football, so what worked at the top, a showcase top division of 20 clubs, would also work at the bottom. And I'm afraid that the big five, as the clubs who were really the agitators at that time, they didn't really care about the third and fourth division, but it was quite easy to recognize that they could be reformed in the same way that you reform the top divisions. You just create more local events at the bottom and more national events at the top. So what that means is you have one national division of 18 or 20 clubs, a second national division of 20 clubs, a third national division of 20 clubs, and then 3 regional divisions of 20 clubs. But it was too revolutionary for the big clubs in the form of David Dean, because he and Martin Edwards and his cohorts were really interested in just getting rid of the smaller clubs. And of course, the smaller clubs have never, ever thought beyond play more matches, earn more money. So there's absolutely no vision in the Football League, no vision in the Football League then, and no vision in the Football League today.
Talking about your book, Arsene and Arsenal, I mean, where did the ideas come from? I know you co-wrote that with Kevin Witcher, but I read the first book. I read both books, actually. The first book was absolutely fantastic. The second one, the latest one, is more about the last season and how that evolved. But can you give me some background on that?
After leaving Saatchi's, I worked as a football consultant, and I advised several Premier League clubs on media and marketing, including Arsenal for a short period. And when I couldn't do the consultancy work, or in order to supplement the consultancy work, I would write books along with usually a co-author about the business and politics of football. So I wrote a general one called Out of Time, and then I started to write about Arsenal and Tottenham. I did one called Heroes and Villains, and a few years later revisited that with another one that was called The Great Divide, and then got to know Kevin Witcher and felt there was enough information and stories about Arsenal. He would know the depth about the club, and I would know about the breadth in terms of the other influences that might affect the club. So between us, it's been a very good working relationship. And we did a book in 2003 called The Glorious Game, and then we followed it up with the one that you just mentioned, Arsenal, The Making of a Modern Super Club, which went through several editions, the latest in 2011. And then the last book was presumably based on a follow-up on the understanding that I had at the beginning of last season, where I actually thought Arsenal were going to break their trophy duck. So what better way of celebrating that than to write a sequel?
How much access did you have?
In the past, an awful lot of access, because I'm a neighbour and a good acquaintance of Arsene Wenger. In fact, I knew Arsene Wenger before David Dean. I first met Arsene in the mid-'80s in the Tottenham boardroom, and I sat next to him during a match. He used to come over when his Monaco team took their winter break. There was a very close relationship with Tottenham. They actually played a friendly game, and Arsene would come across and get his fill of English football, which he was a great fan of. And his first stop was at White Hart Lane because of the relationship with Tottenham. And I can remember sitting next to him in the mid-'80s, and I was telling him about the heritage and tradition of Tottenham, and how they needed to find themselves, and suggested that if he ever wanted to manage in England, then because of Tottenham's heritage and tradition, that was the club for him. And although people might find it very surprising now, it was really just before George Graham took over the Arsenal, so that was 1-0 to the Arsenal, victory above all. And Tottenham, it was just before the David Pleat era, where they played an innovative, expansive football. So in Wenger's mind, I mean, Tottenham was the team rather than Arsenal.
Alex, just looking at the, you were talking about that you recommended to the Premier League that they only have 18 teams. Now, we all know the most dominant force in European football at the moment is arguably the German League. Now, the German League only have 18 teams, and I think from many years ago when Italy had a massively dominant league, I'm sure they only had 18 teams. Back in the early 2000s, they changed it to 20 teams. So do you reckon the FA would ever, the Premier League, which is the same thing, would ever look at that and go, well, actually, Italy was successful with 18, Germany are dominating with 18, maybe we should give it a go with 18, or do you think the clubs would never let the FA do it?
Only one man in the breakaway clubs of 22 voted for 18, and that was David Dean of Arsenal. David Dean has always felt, in fact, he is more consistent than I am. I've said 18 or 20. He's always stuck with 18. And the point about 18 is that everybody would be playing for something. You'd be playing for the title. You'd be playing for a Champions League spot. You'd be playing for another European place, or you'd be playing for the avoidance of relegation. Every game would be important. Because you're playing fewer games, less would truly equal more because the quality of the games would be better. You'd lose the stragglers at the bottom, and fewer games would mean lower overheads, and fewer games, because they're more important, would mean higher crowds and bigger television audiences. So really, it's really a non sequitur that you shouldn't have anything more than 20 clubs.
Do you think it's any coincidence that, I just checked, the Italian Serie A turned from an 18 to a 20-team league in 2004-05, and that's around the era where Italian football started to fall apart? And also, do you think that if we did ever change to an 18-team league, do you think the price of season tickets would go down because of the 2 less games?
Season ticket prices will never go down because fans are different from customers. A customer can take his business elsewhere, a fan can't. And there are many more fans than can be accommodated. In spite of the really obscene prices of some season tickets, the Premier League over the course of a season for all clubs plays in an average capacity for the stadium of over 95%. So why should anybody drop prices? They should only drop prices if they start to treat fans like customers, believing that they should ask themselves, what is it that we can do that our fans want? But they don't have to do that because they know that if the fans don't like it, there are plenty more waiting outside. So we'll never go down to 18 clubs. What's more important, though, is that you cannot measure a country's football relevance by 20 clubs alone. In Germany, they have 38. And so what you have is you don't just have 38 clubs that matter, you have 38 academies that matter. And you also have no chasm between the top 2 divisions. In Bundesliga 1 and Bundesliga 2, you're able to bridge the gap by other factors than just money. Firstly, because the television money is spread more equitably. It's 80-20, 80 to the top division, 20 to the second. And because of that, other factors come into play. A good coach, a good youth policy, judicious use of the transfer market. So you have clubs moving up and down, players moving up and down, and therefore you have a pool of national players who are far richer, both in numbers and in quality, than we will ever have in England. And I can't see how we're going to get anywhere like that unless, and it's a compromise situation, you create Premier League 2. And then at least in England, you'll have 40 clubs that matter, as opposed to just 20.
Alex, if we can go back to David Dein, what can you tell us about the situation that ended up David Dein leaving Arsenal Football Club? What do you know as what happened in that particular situation?
Well, I've got a fair knowledge. In fact, I've got more than I can tell you. But this is what I'll say. First of all, you've got to understand that David Dein loves Arsenal. I mean, he loves Arsenal as much as the 3 of you combined. It's the most important thing in his life next to his family. And he would do anything that would benefit Arsenal. The problem is, his view is, I would never knowingly do anything that would upset Arsenal. But he would always act according to his own instincts. And he would back those instincts rather than taking a collective view of the board. So when he first came onto the board, he was like, this is my description, he wouldn't go along with this, but it was like a drunk let loose in a brewery. You know, it was the dream that he woke up and found it was reality. And as such, initially had his head turned, I think, because he got too friendly with the players. Then, because of his commitment to the club, I think George Graham rather used him. I can remember an incident where I was working for Arsenal and I challenged George Graham, and David decided to leave me. Well, I'll explain the situation. I mean, it was the end of a meeting. Graham was just chatting to some journalists. Both David Dean and I wanted to get back into town. David was giving George a lift, and I said, "Come on, tell him we want to go," and he wouldn't, and it was left to me. And Graham just ignored me, and I left, and Dean just waited on, I'm afraid, Graham's decision when and where he wanted to go. So because David wanted to be so close to the players, to the team, he put up with a lot of stuff from George Graham that he never had to put up with from Arsene Wenger. Nevertheless, it was Dean who put the club really before a personality. It was Dean, for example, who bought Ian Wright and allowed George Graham to take the plaudits. It was Dean who ensured that the game against Sheffield United should be replayed, not Wenger, and Wenger received a UEFA Fair Play Award for it. So where David Dean's instincts were right, he was a force for good, but occasionally he felt that he should act in a way that he knew what was right, and it was against the board's wishes. He preferred Wembley rather than a new stadium. And then he wanted always to prioritize the team rather than a stadium. He would say, when I get up in the morning, I see written across my forehead the message, "Get a winning team." So when Arsenal was struggling, the finance of the stadium was overwhelming to some extent, he felt he should go and get a sugar daddy. So the board didn't want to have any truck with Stan Kroenke at that time, but David Dean thought he knew better. He put himself out on a limb, and the board had the opportunity to cut him off, and that's what they did.
Has David Dean's absence from Arsene Wenger's professional life, I mean, especially transfers, been a greater loss than Arsene would care to admit?
Absolutely. David Dean and Arsene would describe themselves as a duo. Arsene said, and I quote, "David did my dirty work for me. David is a born salesman. He loved negotiating. Arsene told him who he might want, and David did and went out, did the negotiation and helped bring back the players. But because of his talent in this area, he even did it before Arsenal arrived. David Dean was instrumental in bringing both David Platt, more important, Dennis Bergkamp to Arsenal. One could say without David Dean, there would be no Dennis Bergkamp. That's in all probability true, and certainly what is true, without David Dean, there would be no Arsene Wenger. Although David Dean did a lot of the nitty-gritty in the transfer work, he never challenged Arsene. He wouldn't say, "Arsene, for God's sake, we need to reinforce the defence, or we need a holding midfielder." He would always feel that Arsene would decide, Arsene would propose, and he would help Arsene dispose. In other words, get them at the best possible price. So in terms of challenging Arsene, which is what he's needed more and more as the years have gone by, particularly since the move to the stadium, I would have my doubts unless David actually changed his modus operandi. We've had a conversation, David Dean and I, subsequently, which he would like to think that he might have changed. I put to him, I said, if you'd have been around, you'd have said, "Come on, Arsene, don't worry about the money. Let's take Xavi Alonso before somebody else does. And don't worry about Mark Schwartz's age. We need an experienced backup. We'll get him. Let me worry about the board." So I put this to David, and he would like to think that he would have acted. And I would like to think he would have acted like that as well. But he never did before he left.
Alex, do you think, is there any way back for David Dein at Arsenal Football Club?
Only if Alisher Usmanov takes over, and only if, and this is what I found astonishing, and I'll give you the conversation. I said to David, why has Arsene never asked for you back? And David replied, the subject hasn't come up. Well, if I was David, I'd jolly well bring it up and just say to him, because they are good friends. I mean, really good friends. And you can say anything to a good friend. And he could say, Arsene, I can help you. And that's a rhetorical statement. With David Dein, I don't think we would have had the really paucity of the last transfer market. The summer business wouldn't have been conducted in the way it has been. It would have been better. If David Dein had been around, Arsenal would be in a better position now. Hopefully he would have challenged Arsene more, but even if he'd just been around, quote, to do Arsene's dirty work for him, the dirty work would have been done much better.
Alec, what's good for Arsenal? It's a simple question. What's good for Arsenal, Kroenke or Red and White Holdings?
A
simple question, but a complex answer.
I know it's a simple question, but there's no simple answer, because
exactly.
Kroenke is an experienced American sports entrepreneur, but he will only start to worry about the financial status of Arsenal when the stadium is half empty, and there's no sign of that. To him, the heritage and tradition of Arsenal are strange bedfellows. To Alisher Usmanov, who says, I'm an Arsenal fan, I support Wenger, but Wenger needs help, you've got to take him at his word. But unless he brought in a David Dein-like figure, I would worry. So I would worry now, because there isn't a David Dein-like figure, and there's no one who really seemingly challenges Arsene. I would worry even more if Alisher Usmanov came up and spent the money and there wasn't someone like David to advise him. He has worked for Alisher Usmanov in the past. Maybe he could work again. But I have a feeling that David would only come back to Arsenal if he was the chairman. And if he was the chairman, then obviously he could work in such a way that would benefit the whole of the club.
What's your view on Stan Kroenke with regards to Arsenal? I mean, in his sports franchises, he doesn't seem to be investing a hell of a lot of money into playing staff, I hear. I mean, and we seem to be carrying along. I know we've got to comply with FFP, but we seem to be carrying along at the moment. We seem to be a well-run club, but it's only the last couple of years we've spent a lot of money. What do you think Kroenke's involvement will be if FFP doesn't really help us as much as what we think it's going to help us?
Well, it's not going to help you as much as you think, because Arsenal's cash reserves are nearly 200 million, which is about the same amount as the other 19 clubs in the Premier League. Arsenal have had money to spend for at least 5 years. It's only in the last 2 or 3 years that they've spent it. 5 or 6 years ago, Danny Fiszman, whose loss is much lamented on many levels, Danny Fiszman said to Arsene, more or less as a joke, what would you do if I gave you 100 million, Arsene? And Arsene replied, I'd give it straight back to you. As if he was trying to prove something, as if he was trying to prove that what he calls financial doping, in other words, buying your way to success, is not the only way. But unfortunately it is, because to have a successful business, you first of all got to have a successful team. And to have a successful team, you've got to spend money. And that is the only way you get a successful team, because the higher the wages you pay, the better quality of player you attract. And Arsenal have only realised this of late, but are not doing it to any pre-planned programme. They've desperately needed a world-class goalkeeper, a world-class central defensive pairing, a world-class holding midfielder, and all they buy are world-class midfielders. I mean, it is bad business. It's bad business, but it's okay so far as the owner is concerned, because it doesn't jeopardize fourth place and Champions League qualification. And you've got to remember that Arsenal are one of the few clubs who regularly make a profit. They last made a loss over a decade ago. He's happy with the situation as it is, because the successful business is, in his terms, defined by Champions League qualification and not by trophies.
He treats our money as if it was his own, observed a delighted Peter Hillwood in 2011, and by all accounts, Wenger has continued to do so. That's a direct quote from your book. When I read that, and I'm sure a lot of other fans read it, I did rage a bit, I have to say, because I found it very, very frustrating. Can you understand why fans find it frustrating when quotes like this are said? I mean, it's not good, surely.
Absolutely. In 2010, and this is a surprising fact, because of income, not just from football, but from property, Arsenal were the biggest club in the world. They were the biggest club in the world. They were turning over 360 million. It was only equaled by Real Madrid. Where have they gone from there? They have made profits, and they've made profits only by selling the best players and from property. And of course, it's very frustrating. Unfortunately, the same will to win does not exist in the boardroom as it does with the fans. If it did, there would be not just money spent, but money that should be accounted for. And it shouldn't just be at the behest of one man. What has happened is, because Arsene has been so successful in terms of meeting the board's requirements, that he has garnered so much power that it's very difficult to take it away from him. And no one is showing any inclination to do that.
I'll give you another Peter Hillwood quote, which is in your book. He says he's referring to supporters groups and some of the campaigns that they had about ticket pricing, etc. And he referred to it as stupid comments from silly people. They are supposed to be supporters, but in fact they do quite a lot of damage. Now, it's not a secret that I'm a member of one of the supporters groups. I've worked with and support the AST as well, and Red Action as a kind of atmosphere type group. We campaign for lower ticket prices. Peter Hillwood comes up with this kind of comment. In your book, you met with many of the supporters groups, if not all of them. I just don't understand why the club will not listen to the groups.
Because they don't have to. It's what I said earlier. There's no need to take any enlightened action because fans are different from customers. A fan will put up with high ticket prices, high merchandise prices, because the club is an object of love and affection, which is their birthright. You know, it's a cliche, but it's a truthful cliche that you change many other things in your life before you change the allegiance to the club. And the club realize that. And therefore, they don't have to take account of fans' views. If you don't like it, well, the most that you can do is to be a nuisance, like some sort of spaniel napping at your ankles. So that's how Hillwood responds. And he is, of course, out of touch with reality on the one hand, in terms of fair play, but totally in touch with reality on another, in discounting what the fans feel, because he doesn't have to take account of them. David Dean was very fond of saying, when I suggested to him that I've been very impressed with some of the supporters that I've met, particularly, the ones in the fan groups. And there are really good men there who would be an asset to the board. And there have always been people like that, more now than hitherto, because of the number of fan groups. And they are a force for good, without exception. And I've said to David Dean in the past, why don't you have a member of a supporters organization on the board? And his retort was, quote, well, what do you think we are if we're not supporters? So that's why fans are not on the board, because the board feel that they're all supporters, but they don't support the club in the way I would suggest that the club needs to be supported in order to get the optimum results both on and off the field.
Alex, talking about the transfer situation, we've had so many years of Arsene being very, very precise in what he needs, filling the right places, letting players go, bringing in the right ones. How long further do you think the club will let him buy players like Sanchez for 35 and Ozil for 42 when that money could well have been spent maybe better on other positions that we need? Although without Sanchez we would be in the bottom half of the league doing really bad without all of his goals. I do personally think that the money should have been better spent on bolstering other positions at the club. Do you think the people at the top see that, and will they let him buy another player for 40-50 million when we could do with 2 or 3 players for maybe 10 or 15 million?
Well, you could have seen that last season and maybe even the season before, but what's happened? No first-class goalkeeper reinforced, no first-class defensive reinforcements, just another midfielder or another attacker. Admittedly first-class, but not what's needed. So it wasn't Arsene who signed the cheque. So you've got to wonder why he has allowed this sort of absolute power in the transfer market.
But he bought players like Andre Arsene, who I think could have turned out to be one of the greatest Arsenal players in Wenger's reign if he'd have used him correctly. Do you think the people at the top at the club think, why is he buying players like that? And then they come on and they play the game against Liverpool where he scored 4 goals, and that first part of that half of the season where he was first joined us, I think he has something like 8 goals in 12 games, and then Wenger goes on to almost single-handedly ruin the player's career by playing someone out of position who isn't willing. Like Sanchez, you play Sanchez wherever you want and you know he's going to give you the game 100%. But people like Ozil, people like Arsene, if you don't play them where they want to play, they're going to sulk and not play well. Do you think the people upstairs will see that and think, well, we can't let him buy any more players of a bit of a free spirit, a bit of a Gaza type, that a free role, because those sort of players don't play well in Wenger's system of you'll play where I play you?
No, they don't see it in the way that you see it. And this is not a new phenomenon. It happened with Anders Limpar and George Graham. Limpar was terrific the first season, and then Graham effectively destroyed him as an Arsenal star because he wanted Limpar to play in a different way. There was no flexibility there. So the board never interfered with Graham then until Graham actually showed that he put himself before the club, and the board will only interfere with Arsene Wenger when he does likewise. And I don't think there's any danger of that happening.
I find talking to people on Twitter and talking to people during the podcast that so many of us can see the problems at the club, but it seems that Wenger either ignores them or doesn't want to admit that to see them, or generally doesn't see them. Like with the situation with the number of players that are going that are leaving the club and not being replaced. Do you think they will continue to let him do this if, like, I don't think we'll finish top 4 this season. That's only my personal point of view, depending on what happens in the January transfer window. Allegedly, we've only got 20 million to spend on players. But if we finish outside the top 4, do you think the club will let Wenger do what Man United have done and just go and spend a load of wages, a load of money to get us back in there? Or do you think they'll still hold the money back?
Well, I don't think he will want to do it that way. You've got to remember again, when George Graham was sort of running down the club, that he really had a different agenda. He was allowed to buy any number of poor players who were just not Arsenal players. But the board backed him, and they only acted when they were forced to. If Arsenal finish 4th, they won't be forced to act. Wenger can buy who he likes. They won't interfere.
Let's talk about Arsene again. Do you think he knows sometimes what the fans are saying or what the fans are feeling? We've had a pretty traumatic last 2 weeks, a 3-3 draw in the Champions League and 2 pretty nasty defeats in the Premier League. Do you know, have you had an experience whether he listens to what the fans are saying on social media? I'm sure he doesn't read any of the stuff, but does it get to him? Is he impervious to that?
I don't want to sound arrogant or boastful, but I got the impression when I used to argue with him that he was unused to having anybody argue with him. We had two major arguments. One, I never was as rude as this, but the bottom line was that I told him that he was useless at substitutions. Obviously, I didn't say it like that, and I can repeat the conversation if you wish. And the other argument was when he just said, I'm going to make Manchester United into the biggest club. Sorry, I'm going to make Arsenal into a bigger club than Manchester United. And I explained to him why that was impossible. And he got shirty with me on both of these occasions. I just don't think he's used to having people challenge his opinion. And that is something which is really unhealthy. You will find a couple of things that repeat themselves in terms of what Wenger says. He says quite often, for many circumstances when people are criticizing him, do you think I've been in this business 40 years and I don't know what I'm doing? He'll use that when somebody will say, you shouldn't attack so much, or you should make more substitutions, or you should look at the opposition more and make plans more for the opposition. You know, that's a stock answer. I've been in this business 40 years and I know what I'm doing. There are some indications last year that some of the areas, not his primary concern, but some of the tangential areas, he is actually allowing a certain amount of delegation. For example, with regard to the conditioning and training and the new personnel and the fact that there are so many injuries, and also with regard to the coaching and education at the academy, where Arsenal, what a criticism this would have been, in danger of losing their number one status as an academy club simply because of the way they were operating. So we've seen new personnel coming into the coaching side and onto conditioning and training. But how much influence they will have, we have to give them some time, and we have to give Wenger time and give them the opportunity. I don't know whether they've been given the opportunity. I mean, Arsenal, for a club that has a reputation for bringing young players on, they had an abysmal season last year, an abysmal season. And we've got to see that there has to be a revolution both in that, and the injury count is absolutely outrageous. So it got to such a point that even Wenger's stubbornness was forced to recognize, well, maybe I'll be open enough to look at other people looking at the situation. So that's the situation we've got now, but then it's a huge leap from there into the actual way that the first team are run. And that's what we've got to wait for.
Alex, I'm a believer that I mean, I'm a big Wenger loyalist, what you might call it. I get a lot of stick on Twitter, especially at the moment. Now, I would say 75-25. It's gone over to now 75% of the fan base maybe want Arsene to leave. A lot of them incredibly wanting to leave right now. Now, I think that would be a mistake. I see it as that although you know we've had trouble over the last few weeks, and I know what you're saying about replacing players and stuff like that. But I think I see Arsenal. You must take into consideration that the two powerhouses that have moved into the Premier League really over the last 10 years in Chelsea and Manchester City. Now, with Arsenal, that they have been a little bit strapped for cash with regards to going and spend the 30 and 40 and the 50 million pounds on the players that are required. And I think that they've done it the best way for the football club for 20 years' time. In other words, they're not really pushing the boat out too far now that they're going to get in under pressure and maybe lose a little bit of status. But we're trying to hang on to that fourth place to retain the Champions League so we can grow, get better players in. And in my belief that Wenger will bring the players that are required in over the next 2 seasons maybe. You know, I don't really get all the stick that he's getting at the moment. Now, do you believe it's best for him to go at the end of the season, Alex?
No, I don't. First of all, I think let's say that you shouldn't make a change until the end of the season. You certainly shouldn't make a change mid-season because Wenger is the best opportunity for Arsenal to get it together and qualify for the Champions League. But what is disappointing is about 3 years ago at the AGM, Arsene was saying that we must go for fourth place, the fourth place trophy. Well, Arsenal should never think like that. And the board should have told him that that wasn't a priority. Having said that, any change now before the end of the season will be wrong because it will be too disruptive and you've got to trust the man who has got it together in past times. But what you've got to look at this time, for the first time in a long time, is that this is a crisis. This is a crisis. Obviously, about 15 clubs in the Premier League would like to have a crisis like this, but it is a crisis. That is because Arsenal have made their worst start in over a quarter of a century, and because there is no hope of it getting better, really, except that when you get all the players back again, the situation will be that Arsenal will win more than they lose, because there are more teams out there. To get fourth place, all you have to do is to beat the teams that you should beat, and that's what Arsenal will get back to doing. So it is quite likely under Wenger they will qualify for fourth place. But they have had a tremendous scare along the way, and they should take heed from this scare and try and get Wenger to make some changes. The difficulty is when you've got a man in his mid-60s with absolute power, it's very difficult for him to change. People forget that when Wenger came, he was a revolutionary, both in terms of what he did on and off the field, marrying the best of the English game to the best of the continental game. But the problem is you tend to be a revolutionary once in your life, and other people copied his ideas and are now past him. So what we've had is a situation where we've, at the beginning of this season, because of the way the transfer business was conducted, as a result of winning the FA Cup, you thought we were going to take a couple of steps forward. But what has happened is that there have been a couple of steps back. Instead of going on from the joy of the victory after 8 or 9 years of a trophyless season after season after season, there should have been a positive plan on how they were going to build on that. And the euphoria of winning, which was shared by thousands and thousands of Arsenal fans in this country and millions across the world, has been let to lie. And it's been let to lie because there has been no planned program. You cannot work in a vacuum. You've got to take account of what Manchester City and Manchester United and what Chelsea are doing. And they have a plan and they are buying success. For example, why on earth reject the wish of Cesc Fabregas to come back to Arsenal? Get rid of 1 or 2 other players, but take Fabregas and you'd have a better team because he's a better player than any of the midfielders at the club at the moment. Why on earth didn't you take him back? Because it didn't fit with Wenger's loyalty to the players that he's groomed. But what he doesn't understand is that he has this loyalty to the club, to its culture. He can't really understand why other people don't share it. And therefore, he was so surprised when people like Van Persie and Nasri left. They left because they didn't share his loyalty and because they saw the opportunity to earn more money and to win trophies elsewhere. Well, it's no way to run a railway, is it?
Staying with what you're saying and also referring to Geoff's question just a minute ago. In 2004, you wrote an article in The Guardian describing Arsene Wenger as, and I quote again, an idealist who wants to win football's big trophies in a style reminiscent of the Brazil team of 1970. 10 years later, it seems that vision has failed. Now, would it be because of what Geoff has said of the two new big clubs that are kind of dominating the league at the moment, or would it be a factor of that plus failures to maybe improve the academy and failures by himself to address balances in the team?
All of those things. But to take the first point, Arsene in the past has said, if I want a player and Chelsea or Real come in for him, then I have to say no thank you. That's a fallacy. He never had to say no thank you. What Arsenal can't do, of course, is to buy these stars wholesale like Manchester City did. For example, at the beginning of last season, they bought half a dozen stars, but the most expensive of them all was about 10 million less than Arsenal paid for Mesut Ozil. They bought Silva, for goodness sake, for 25 million. So there are players out there who could be bought at the right price, who would give you value for money. So that's on one level. Players should have been bought, quality players should have been bought for several seasons now, and to hell with the price. And it wouldn't have been 50 million. Why they paid 42 million for Ozil is something that only the board and Arsene know. I don't suggest that Arsene was happy about paying that sort of money because he never has been in the past. So far as the academy is concerned, it has been allowed to run down simply because, not simply because, and I'm maybe being a bit unfair, but Liam Brady was one of the greatest players Arsenal ever had. And as a youth coach, I'm afraid that he didn't bring enough people on. If you ask Liam Brady, which somebody did about only a year or so ago, what are the successes of the academy, he'll still point to Ashley Cole and Kieran Gibbs. And Kieran Gibbs only came because I think the Wimbledon programme was disbanded. How many is that? Oh, forgive me, and Jack Wilshere. But that's not sufficient. I mean, if you look at other academies, they have put some sort of priority on them. Maybe the manager gets more involved. Maybe if the manager is delegating, then he delegates in such a way that you have people who are not old school. That's what Arsenal were. They were old school, and they approach both the short-term business of winning the Premiership and the long-term business of building a youth factory in a way that was not realistic because it paid no heed to what the competition were doing. And Arsenal have been really outspent, outmaneuvered, outthought and outplayed almost at every level by the standards that they set themselves, which are the very highest. And by those high standards, you can only say that Arsenal have had a successful business, but certainly not the best business they could have had because they haven't won the trophies that they should have had.
If we can more or less wrap this up about maybe Arsene for the moment, but it's getting depressing. I've got one further question. Let's move forward to, let's say, May. We've had a disaster. We've finished 5th on the last day of the season. We haven't won a trophy. Is Arsene the type of chap to dust his hands and say, "Okay, boys, I've gone as far as I can go at this project," or do you think he's going to need to be pushed?
He's a very proud man, but you've also got to look at his history as well. His first managerial job at Nancy, he did very well the first season, but the second season they were relegated. But then he went to Monaco. He only left Monaco because he didn't feel he was ready for Bayern Munich, and they had a very bad start to the season, and he was fired. That hurt him deeply, A, because he showed his loyalty to his employers, which was then rewarded with summary dismissal. And therefore, he realized that the last year of a contract is always beneficial to the club. But he has just signed a longer term contract than that. And I just think that if Arsenal had lost to Hull, then he may have felt the disappointment so greatly that he would have gone. I don't think it will be the same level of disappointment this time, because Arsenal have reached a level where, in his terms, if they move upwards and establish fourth place, then he can still see a solid platform on which to build for next season. So I can only see the same sort of situation as I envisage if they'd have lost the FA Cup final, if Arsenal finish nearer the relegation spots than the Champions League spots.
You've been doing a series of talks. I know you did one at the AST a little while ago. It's called Arsene, David Dein and Me. Can you give us a little bit of information about that?
Yeah, it was just lots of personal anecdotes, because I felt I was amongst friends and I felt I could be revealing as to, for example, a few anecdotes about Arsene's humour, a few anecdotes about David Dein's commitment, but also some revelations on how the two of them worked very well together and how it was so surprising that they're still not working together. In terms of Arsenal's, in terms of Arsene's humour, I can tell you something. In front of the book, in the book you've got in front of you, there's a quote from Arsene, isn't there? Maybe it's on the back of the book, depending on what book you've got.
My one's on the iPad, so I'll have to scroll through to the end.
Sorry, mine's not in front of me, but it says, Alex Fynn is a football guru, and I'm always interested in what he has to say. Well, I told the AST that I had to pay him an awful lot of money for that. But in truth, when I asked him for a quote for the book, his first offering was, Alex Fynn is a Tottenham fan, so what's he doing interviewing me and writing books on Arsenal? And I said, I can't put that on the book, and you know I can't put that on the book. And it was me who really suggested he says something a bit nicer, and he went along with what I suggested. He has a really sardonic sense of humour. When asked how he would celebrate his birthday, he said, I'll put candles on top of the television set. He is a football obsessive, and yet he finds time to read biographies, keep up to date with French politics in particular. But David Dein has said that if you're going to buy a second-hand car, always go for Arsene's, because the only journeys it takes are from Totteridge, where he lives, the 6 miles round to London Coney, and then from Totteridge to the maybe 6 miles into the stadium. So, you buy Arsene's, first of all, he had a Mercedes, and now he's got a Lexus. Just look out for them on the market and go for that.
Low mileage.
Low mileage. And in terms of David Dein, as I said to you, was very tentative with regard to George Graham. And Graham took advantage of that, took advantage of Dean's commitment. Dean put up with a lot of nonsense from Graham because he felt that Graham was a terrific manager for Arsenal, and he was right, and because he felt that he could, help Graham, as I gave you an example by buying Ian Wright for him, and for the club, of course. So after his first year of working with Arsene, David Dein very tentatively, remembering how his experience with Graham was, suggested to Arsene, said, Arsene, have there been changes? And if there have, what change have you noticed above all? And Arsene said, the improvement in your French. So that's how he answered Dean. In other words, he was being frivolous, but humorous. You know, he wasn't going to say, well, I think I bought X or Y. He just said the improvement in your French, because he'd sent Dean across to do the negotiating for him.
Where do you see Arsenal in 5 years' time, Alex, in your opinion?
Well, Alex Ferguson went until he was 71. I don't think Arsene will go that far, because the family do want to go back to France. There was a chance to say, oh, I see a message here. It said, Dean only rang Palace to inquire about Bright, and then they said you can have Righty for 2.5 million. He said, okay.
That was me that put that. Is that right?
I know it's not how the conversation went. The conversation went like this. Dean asked Ron Nodes, he said, would you ever sell Ian Wright? And Ron Nodes said, well, I suppose I'd have to if someone offered, you know, a ridiculous amount. And Dean said, what would you call a ridiculous amount? And Nodes said 2.5 million. So Dean said, well, I'll offer you 2.5 million. I beg pardon. He said, I'm offering you 2.5 million for Ian Wright. And Nodes was forced to agree. But the end of the story is George Graham was having a golfing day. And Dean rang to the golfing day, and it was the golfing day with the press. And he said, we just bought Ian Wright, you can announce it to the press people. So he announced it. We've just bought Ian Wright, as if it was his coup, but it was Dean.
Well, that's one of my favourite footballing stories. And Ian Wright says in his book that when he couldn't believe that Arsenal wanted him, he went there and they said, here's the contract, sign it. And only after he signed the contract, he went, oh, by the way, how much am I on per week? Is that right as well?
That's absolutely right.
Oh, wow.
He came in, Dean and he struck up an immediate rapport. You've got to remember, Dean loved the players, would do anything for them. And Dean came in, Wright came in, and he said, where do I sign? And Dean says, don't you want to know what the conditions are? He said, no, I just want to sign. I just want to sign. And that obviously endeared Wright to Dean, as it would. You know, there are very few directors like that who would go out of their way for the players. You may not want to hear this, but another one was Irving Scholar, who, when Ozzy Ardiles wanted a salary rise up to about, this is how long ago, 80,000 a year, a Scholar told him to go away in no uncertain terms. Ardiles backed tentatively out of the room and said, you think about it, please. And Scholar said, you're getting 90 and nothing more, now go. So sometimes when you have chairmen or directors like Irving Scholar and David Dean that love the players, they would try and do anything for them.
Well, Alex, this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion with you tonight, and I'd love to talk for hours and hours, but I've got one more question for you. What does the future hold for Alex Fynn?
I'm afraid that I'm yesterday's man. I'm on the outside looking in. I feel that there are a lot of sour grapes on my side, so much so that it's probably a sour vineyard. I really feel that if the FA had listened to me, I could have had a hand in reshaping football. And because I do what my advertising upbringing had taught me to do, which is to go and find out what the people want and then try and do what they need, I think that I could have helped English football. It's a very, people will think I'm boasting and dreaming, but I really think I could have helped English football get to a much better place. I think that there wouldn't have been a contradiction between having a showcase top division and having a very sound regional division and having over 100 professional clubs and also having a successful national team, because I would have borrowed my ideas slavishly from what they do in America in terms of marketing and what they do in Germany in terms of football structure. So I wouldn't have thought that there would have been a lot of ego to play with me. I just felt that we could have structured things in a so much better way that it would help the big clubs, the small clubs, and the national team. But then a lot of good fans would think likewise. and they will never have the opportunity, and neither will I. The situation was I got quite close to it. I actually got outside the FA's boardroom when I heard them discussing my plans, and I couldn't believe, how they were so keen to sort of denigrate me on a personal basis rather than look at the value of the plans themselves. I was more trouble than I was worth. I realize I'm not everyone's cup of tea, but I was probably someone who would upset the apple cart, and therefore someone who should and would be sent packing, and I duly was. So my future is really on the outside looking in, hoping Arsenal win a trophy this year, and supporting a number of clubs. I support the clubs who have been quite kind to me, who I've enjoyed working with, and just as a rule of thumb, this is what I've experienced. The smaller the club in the Premier League, the nicer they are until you hit the Northeast. And that's based on working in terms of television rights for about half a dozen of them. And the best clubs were those who had you in for your expertise and allowed you to do it. And one of my biggest disappointments is that my friend of 40 years, David Dean, never had me in so that he and I could have been a duo, and he and I could have done a much better marketing job for Arsenal working together than he did on his own. He didn't do a bad job on his own, but if he'd had me alongside him, we'd have done a better job. So unfortunately, I have many faults, and one of the worst is regrets. So I do regret missed opportunities. So I just hope that people these days will read the book and enjoy it. By the way, you can get it at a special deal if you use the Bergkamp code and go to the Vision Sports website. You'll get it at about 45% off, at about $7.27 or $7.47. The code is Bergkamp.
Well, I found you very honest and engaging, Alex, and I think you've still got something to give to the footballing community, and I'd just say never, mate. So keep hanging on. Danny, you want to plug some books of Alex's?
Yeah, sure. If you go to Vision, which is visionsp.co.uk, Alex's both his books on there. I didn't know that he was going to do that special offer, which is a shame because I've already bought both of mine from Amazon ages ago. You got Arsenal: The Making of a Super Club by Alex, Fynn and Kevin Witcher, which at the moment on there is £6.49. So if you use your code of Bergkamp when you do a checkout, I think he said it's going to be less. And the other book is Arsene and Arsenal, again by Alex, Fynn and Kevin Witcher, which at the moment is £8.99. Go and support the publisher and the authors and go and buy two fantastic books.
Thank you very much for saying that.
That's okay. It's true. It's fantastic. Two of my favourite books. There's been quite a few. I mean, I've got about 50 books, but I'm always buying more. I've got 5 on my table in front of me. But yeah, I think all the credit should go to the people who spend so much time writing them and researching them and doing them. They're an absolute joy to read.
You did write the Great Divide. That's a great tale of between the two, Arsenal and Arsenal and Tottenham Hotspurs, isn't it? I remember reading it a few years back now. It's a fantastic read. It's it's great for an Arsenal fan.
Yeah, but that's it. It was compare and contrast, and I started this off with a book called Heroes and Villains, which was in '91. And believe it or not, the reason that I wrote that book was that I believed that, apparently I've no recollection of actually saying this, but I did a few focus groups to understand what both sets of fans felt. And apparently in one of them I said, well, I think Tottenham are going to win the cup and Arsenal are going to win the league. I've no recollection, and if I'm not a betting man, but if I had been, then I wouldn't have to worry about what I'm doing now, would I?
Well, that book is also on Amazon. You did it with Olivia Blair, and that is available for 1p.
Yeah, the Great Divide you can buy for 1p, but postage and packing. You can also buy the first one, Heroes and Villains, which is the 1991 season. The fans liked it because obviously Tottenham was successful and Arsenal was successful, and Tottenham combusted as well. I wouldn't say it's a particularly good book, but there are some good passages in it. But Olivia Blair is a good writer, and she's a Tottenham fan, and I was taking the Arsenal cause, and we got a lot of access for the Great Divide. I can remember interviewing Graham, Dean, Fisman, Wenger on several occasions, and it was interesting. And one of the ideas I had was sort of to revise that one, sort of summarize the Great Divide, and then compare it again with what's happening this season. But a publisher was going to do that and then dropped out. So I don't think I'll be doing too much more in the future.
Well, Alex, all I can say is thank you very, very much for coming on tonight, and hopefully we'll try and get you back on again soon.
Well, Roger, it was a great pleasure to meet you and your colleagues. Thank you very much for having me. I feel a bit humble with people who commit so much to the club that they love. I don't feel the same way, and therefore I respect and honour your commitment, and thank you so much for allowing me to share the time with you.
Not a problem.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Brilliant,
And,
mate. Thanks very much.
I should say thanks to our producer, Danny, for being here tonight. I know he had to set his alarm to get up today. So I'll be talking to you soon, hopefully, my friend.
Yeah.
And to Geoff, sorry for the grief I've given you for the last 2 days.
It's a pleasure, Raj. It's a pleasure.
Let's just talk about music for the next 5 days. How about that?
No, we'll carry on as we are, mate. Don't worry.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. I think that's the end of tonight's podcast. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.